Okay, let's call this meeting to order. Welcome again to Minds, Technology, and Society. Thank the Glushko and Samuelson Foundations for funding, and the School of Social Sciences, Humanities, and Arts. Our speaker today is Professor Joanna Bryson. Joanna is a professor, well, I guess a reader, which is their associate professor equivalent at the University of Bath in the Department of Computer Science. She's also an affiliate at the Center for Information Technology Policy at Princeton University. Joanna got her Ph.D. in computer science at MIT and was one of the original, or was involved anyway, in the creation of the Lego Mindstorms robots. She is best known for work in artificial intelligence and also ethics, but has worked in biology, anthropology, sociology, cognitive science, political science, kind of running the gamut. Today she'll be talking about her work on public goods, cooperation, political polarization. I just want to make a quick plug that tomorrow she'll be giving a guest talk in my Introduction to Cognitive Science class, focusing on bias and ethics in artificial intelligence, and that is open, so for those interested in that topic, you guys are welcome to show up. It's at 2 p.m. in the auditorium. But yeah, so today, cultural variation in public goods investment and political polarization. So let's give Joanna Bryson a big welcome.
Okay, well, thank you very much. I don't know if I should, oh, that's a light. Should I do microphone, or is that okay? You're okay? It's all right. Okay, all right. Let me know if I start talking too fast or too strangely, and I'll try to slow down, or go ahead and ask questions. I will tell you if I'd rather postpone that till the end for the Q&A, or if it's a good thing to talk about right now. So I'm not afraid to do that. So you shouldn't be afraid to ask. All right. So yeah, cooperative. Are you guys cooperative? Yeah, pretty cooperative. Yeah. I think we can all agree that when we think about public goods, that Amsterdam is a pretty big public good. This is Amsterdam if the sea level rises 3 meters, which is of course an active danger given what's going on in the Arctic this winter. What are you doing to help Amsterdam? Right? So the last few years, I've actually been doing, or trying to spend a lot of time working on understanding cultural variation in public goods investment. And I'll talk about that research the first half of the talk. But originally, yeah, I listed this in. I wasn't sure if I should, but I did. I'm not going to talk much about AI ethics in this talk anyway, but I still will tell you why I started doing political polarization. I do a lot of AI ethics, and I got asked whether AI is causing inequality on live television, and I didn't know the answer. I didn't know anything about inequality, and so I went to a talk and found out, well, what you're going to see, which is basically, I think I found, first of all, I was already working on understanding a correspondence between other regarding tendencies, which is a concept from psychology, and some of the regularities that people had been having trouble explaining in antisocial punishment in behavioral economics. So how many people here self-identify as economists? Anyone? How many people sort of read the behavioral economics literature without self-identifying as an economist? Okay, not too many. Okay. What about psychology? How many people have a degree in psychology or feel like they're psychologists? Okay. Do you know the Van Lange stuff on other regarding preferences? All right, lots of new stuff. Right, cool. But the interesting thing is that now, and this is the first time I presented this, so thank you very much for Paul for inviting me to do this. Although it's only one slide, it's towards the end, but I'm excited that we've got some new results, although I've presented some of my older results on this before, but we've got some new modeling results on trying to understand political polarization, which falls out of some of the work I was previously doing on human cooperation. All right, so the thesis for this talk, back to that whole question about Amsterdam, is that when we think about altruistic, we often think like, oh, that's just good. You should do it all the time. Good just is limit up. Do as much as you can of goodness, right? But what I'm claiming here is that what we call altruistic is actually increasing public goods investment for some public. right, in some public goods, right? And what we call antisocial is actually could be thought of as increasing, direct investment in the individual, right? Or it might actually be that you're investing in some other public and people just weren't paying attention to that, right? So in fact, in real life, and most of the time, you have to trade these off. It's the whole old thing about the first time you fly and they tell you put your own oxygen mask on and ignore everybody else, and you think, that's not right. Yeah, but of course, when you think about it, of course it's right. You've got to be able to breathe before you can help other people breathe, right? If you're passed out, then everything loses. So the claim I'm going to have here is that getting an optimal trade-off between these often will be best achieved by having mixed strategies. So different people in different people in the same population will take different strategies, and that's going to be the best way to optimize. All right. And also, I'm going to claim that. I don't know why I'm talking about state failure here. Sorry, I'm not actually going to talk about state failure. Ask me in Q&A. I can talk about that. But I will talk about political polarization. All right, so biology can account for sociality and cooperation, just in case that there's any confusion about that. This is the one case where maybe in the real world, the thing that is the replicator, the thing that's trying to push itself into the future, is also going head-to-head with another thing that's a replicator. And this is not even agreed, right? But when we talk about selfish genes, the one time that you might want to be selfish is when you're doing crossover, when you're having sex, right? Because then this gene, if there was a gene right here, it would have gotten broken up, it got broken in half and put onto two different individuals, right? But this gene up here is winning because there's no crossover right there, so it's not broken up. Okay? Nobody even, last I knew, there's been no established fact of this matter. But basically the idea here is genes are not the ones that are competing out in the real world. And the stuff that we think about as doing all this competition, there can only be one, right, kind of thing, actually have lots of genes, right? Lots of genes on the deer. And actually a lot of those genes are the same, all right? And the fact that a lot of those genes are the same means that you can get situations like this, right? So these are probably sisters, and they're maybe willing to throw one of them under the bus to be able to get, to outcompete the lion here for something, all right? So that's the kind of idea that you might be able to get there because actually, and again, these guys are sharing a fair number of genes compared to the grass, right? And the grass is all in the ecosystem together. So, yes, selfish genes doesn't mean you have to have selfish individuals. So traits that are advantageous to community, it used to be considered oh, yeah, sure, it'd be nice if we all lived in a hippie, nice, prosperous world, but we can't get there. Evolution can't get there because evolution is all about selfishness. And we realized afterwards that we weren't thinking about this very well. So this goes by a lot of names, and yes, I know some of the controversies, but if you've heard any of these terms, that you can more or less get the idea. The main point is that what you're transmitting is a replicator, but the unit of selection of the vehicle is made out of a lot of them, right? And so that's how you can find mutual interests that can get you to do cooperative actions, like possibly even sacrifice yourself, so that others sharing your same genes will go forward, right? So that's the basic idea. Okay, so now going back to public goods, the idea of public good is that that there's stuff out there that any member of society has access to. And again, if you thought that you couldn't select for altruism, this would seem like an impossible thing to build. And actually, if it was really that anybody could get access to it, you'd be in trouble. Because those hyenas knew each other, right? They had they knew each other, they'd probably grown up together, they had a lot of genes in common. But let me go, sorry, I'm being a little incoherent because I got 9 hours of jet lag, sorry about that. All right, so there's, the examples people usually use for public goods are things like roads and bridges, security, and language is not one they usually use, but that's how I came into this whole thing. I was trying to understand why people were sharing so much information. All right, but even if you think about roads and bridges, oh yeah, sorry, getting my own pills. So another possible thesis, which I haven't pursued hard, but you might even want to think about a public as being defined by the goods that it protects. That may actually be what a public is, right? And the version of this is security. So the most essential aspect of governance is that you take resources from a group of people and then you defend that group of people, that there's a wall or something, that you have something going on there. All right? So that's all very nice, but in the real world, when you build a bridge, it doesn't actually benefit everybody equally. Some people live closer to the bridge and some people live further away. And so there's another set of goods that we call semi-private goods, which are things that you can defend and define them as somewhat costly. And so actually everybody has access to them, but it's not equal because you might decide to defend harder against things. And so this is kind of what we're doing when we're arguing about, like, where do we put the bridge, right? And the important idea here is that theoretical biology can account for these. So I hope I haven't been too confusing before. I hope you see there was this idea of the altruistic and the antisocial and that you might have to trade this off. Then I told you could get cooperation. And now what I'm telling you is it's hard or impossible in biology to get cooperation if everybody has access to the same stuff because it's easy to free ride, it's easy to not cooperate. But if you even a little bit, even if you're just a little better off because you're a little closer to the bridge, then you can start organizing this stuff, okay? So, yeah, public goods, or things that are typically thought of as public goods, can actually be accounted for by evolution. As I said, lots of things that people thought. How many people think of themselves as anthropologists here? Nobody, okay. I know Paul best, so I think of you guys coming out of this. So two of the things that people talk about a lot about in terms of early cooperation and humans becoming this special thing that we are now is meat sharing and warfare, okay? And the thing about meat sharing was that as far as anybody could tell, the hunters would go off and they'd bring this food back and they'd share it with everyone, and they didn't seem to have control over their own product, so why were they doing that? But it actually turns out that there are some people who shirk, and those people are teenagers. So hunting is really, really hard, and only the men are doing it, and the boys don't catch anything for like 7 years. I mean, it's really hard to learn the skill. And so of course they get discouraged and think this is boring and want to stay home. And if they do stay home, they don't get any of the meat, right? So there is actually control. On the other hand, with security, you could say, well, yeah, okay, we've all benefited from the fact that these warriors have gone off and, say, raided some cattle from some other people. But in this case, they actually, again, this warfare, and this is actually work by Pete Richardson, that it turns out that the benefit from the direct benefit that you receive because you get rewarded with some cattle is the only way that you would even have children. That's the only way you can pay dowry. So again, this thing that was seen as very altruistic, or also they were looking at was there punishment or what was going on, you could actually come up with direct fitness. And so this was all work that my PhD student Dan Taylor did. He's my only recent PhD student who hasn't gone on into academia because he decided to become a science fiction writer. But yeah, it was actually externally examined by an actual anthropologist of some hunter-gatherers, and it's a nice dissertation. So even though you don't have a lot of papers on this, I do recommend reading it if you care about that sort of game theory stuff. All right, so also, yeah, we'll talk about that later. So back to what I said, this is sort of like the outline of the talk. Let's talk about antisocial punishment. All right, so how many people have seen this figure before? One? Only one? Okay. This was the cover of Science in March or something of 2008. And it was a discovery. A lot of people thought that humans were unique around this time. They thought humans were unique. We cooperate a lot because we punished each other if we didn't. Now this is cyclic reasoning because obviously the punishing each other for not cooperating is a form of cooperation, right? But anyway, I had already been doing some other work, the stuff that just flicked up there with Ivana Chacha looking at origins of language, and we already knew that you could get cooperation, as I've described to you earlier in this talk, that just by some simple ideas like that babies are born near their mothers, which mathematicians can forget things like that. Babies are born near their mothers, and it takes time to move. So you're likely to be near a relative, so it's okay. So you can evolve cooperation, right? So anyway, so a lot of people were excited about the idea that punishment was a way that you could keep people cooperating, and what these guys showed was that some cultures, there's a lot of cultural variation in punishing those who give the public good, right? So the green things over there, the dark green, are people that are punishing you for not giving to the public good, and it's true, that's pretty much culturally universal. But what's weird and what varies a lot is punishing people that give you stuff, all right, that contribute more than you do to the public good, all right? So that was a big deal back in 2008, and I still don't think it's very well explained, except of course by our group. We have a few publications which I'll knock through here, and we still have some more coming out too. So first of all, what is this data? It's not just colors, all right? A public goods game is something where you have 4 anonymous players and you have them all contribute. So you give them like 20 tokens at the beginning. And these are economists, so they don't believe that people will do stuff unless they're getting real money. So they're playing for like a half day's wages, all right? So you don't actually multiply it by 3 because that's too expensive, but it's easier to reason about that. So my example here is going to be 3, okay? So you got 4 people in the group, and you tell them, and you give them 20 poker chips, and they know how much those poker chips are worth and that they're going to get money at the end. And you say, for everything you put into the kitty in the middle, I'm going to triple it. I did the magic experiment. Now you can see that the best thing, the way to get the most money as a group is you all put all your chips in, and then you get 3 times as much money, right? However, this is called a social dilemma because for every chip that you put in, you're only getting 3/4 of your chip back, right? Because it's getting multiplied by 3 but divided by 4, all right? So for you, the best thing that would happen is if all the other 3 all put their chips in and you did it, right? So this is the complicated thing. And that's literally the definition of altruism, if you pay a cost to benefit others. So the economists originally predicted, oh, nobody will cooperate. And much to their astonishment, what happens in the first move, and this is the first move, that's what the 1 is for, is people put in half their money because I guess they have no idea what to do. All right, we can judge it. But then they said, okay, well, what happens if we let them do that again? And what you see is that the cooperation is declining. And as I said, this is very expensive. So they said, well, we can see that it's going to cost 0, so let's just stop there. Six rounds is enough. But now we're going to introduce, and this, how many people have seen this slide before? If you go to the European Human Behavior Evolution Association, one year I went there and literally every talk had this slide. It was just amazing. But I'm going to give it again because I give it slightly differently. So there's this idea that punishment stabilizes it, which, okay, it's still it's going up, but because of those error bars, that's not significant, right? But what is punishment? Again, you get to pay the magic experimenter to take away, you pay 1 and they take 3 away from someone else, okay? So that was the story, that was the old era. This is 2002, not 2008. I should say that Simon Gachter is one of the coolest people in behavioral economics, a very honest person, good, reliable publications. He finally got enough money to test this whole thing about passing 0. And it turns out that if you give people more rounds, and they know, again, economists tell you everything, they know how many rounds they have, the start and the end point are the same and the slope changes, all right? So they never cross 0. Who knows what the mechanism is here? This is just bizarre, all right? But he said, I literally got this one from him. We should have known because even back in 2000, what you saw was if you changed, what's happening here is that they changed the group membership. So every time they changed group membership, they went up to signaling. They started signaling more or something, and they started increasing cooperation, and then it declined. So it seems like there's 2 different things going on here. Anyway, that's not really the point of my talk, except for to point out that the behavioral economists were confused. The point of my talk here is now what is going on with all these different countries? Well, yeah, so Ferenc Gachter had done this stuff in Switzerland. And there was a lot of assumptions. Again, I guess it was a few years ago that I was last at the European Human Behavior Evolution Association. But people would assume that what they did in their lab was a human universal. And one of the cool things was this guy, Benedikt Herrmann, the first author here. Apparently, he was doing a postdoc in Switzerland, and he heard about this research. Yes?
Oh, sorry. Just a quick question about the BGGs as a whole. Are they supposed to be a stand-in for, or is that experiment paradigm supposed to be a stand-in for a common human experience? Because it seems to me that, like, if I'm trying to build a house or something like that, the plumber is going to contribute what they can, and I'm going to contribute what I can. Together we're going to have a house that seems to be more than what either of us could possibly hope to get.
That's a great question. And there is a lot of confusion about whether or not this is in any way realistic. And people argue the same thing. If you're in psychology, the same thing about experimental psychology. Is it lab, or you want to go out and do sociology, basically look at people in the wild. I will show in a couple slides that there are correlates between these results and national characteristics or economic characteristics. So that leads us to believe that they are measuring something that's real. And then I'll show you a hypothesis about this, but then we can come back on this discussion in Q&A about like what are the real world consequences, okay? All right, so, a lot of people thought, okay, the stuff that happened at ETH explains what's happening in the whole wide world, but in fact, Benedikt Herrmann, as I said, he had done, I forgot what his previous work had been in, but he'd done some work in Russia, and he was convinced as a German that the Russians let anything happen, and he was just really offended by they would just listen to stuff on the radio that had smoke coming out of his ears, and they're all like, whatever, right? So he was wrong. He thought they wouldn't punish no matter what, but yeah, they do have punishment, but they also have this antisocial punishment. So he was right that there's cultural variation, but wrong that they wouldn't punish people who didn't give enough. I mean, notice topically to 2008, that Athens is one of these countries that even punishes you if you give the same amount, right? That was, and the Greeks were in a hard place at that point. Anyway, so here's what's happening looking at it the way Frank Gechter, and by the way, it's not the first you do it without punishment, then you do it with punishment within subject to you control for that. Okay, it's just the way it's presented. But the really interesting thing here is that okay, there's a bunch of countries where it looks like as soon as you find out that there's going to be punishment, you just jump into a more cooperative, like look at Boston. Okay, it's not a bunch, but there's a few that it sort of looks like you immediately say, okay, we're going to cooperate more. And then there's these countries that you both don't have the increased cooperation, but you also don't have the decline between rounds. And then over in the Far East, which for some reason includes Melbourne, you actually have people don't look like they expect very good things when the punishment comes in, and yet they're able to find the equilibrium, the positive, so they're able to climb that gradient with experience. So why can't these guys? Right, what's going on? Poor Istanbul, worst of both worlds. They look like Europe and without punishment, they look like the Middle East with punishment. But by and large, so what's going on? First of all, why would you ever engage in antisocial punishment? I just told you you can evolve cooperation. But this isn't cooperative, you're stopping people from giving you stuff. What is going on, right? And then the other thing, and this is kind of stealthily bringing in the stuff I just promised you, which is it turns out that there were regularities, and in the science paper they go and try to find accounts for this. And it turns out that first of all, of the sample that they did, which they had trouble getting money for this, so it was just places they were able to go. Basically, it looked like this antisocial punishment behavior was prevalent mostly in the former Soviet and Ottoman Empire areas. But it actually turned out to be perhaps more important that anti-correlates with both GDP and rule of law. And these things correlate with each other, so it's hard to figure out all the causality there. But this has been shown to be true also as you get into India and Mexico and things like that. So this regularity holds beyond what the original paper. All right, so I'm hoping I sometimes try to apologize for the fact that I talk about biology a lot, but I'm assuming you guys don't mind that because you're a complexity group, right? So here's a weird source of information about what might possibly be going on. But it just happens that these guys, two or three of them were actually working at the University of Bath. So I saw this talk, this paper when it came, as a talk, but it came out in the early noughts. Not the early noughts, the early teens, whatever we were in. First of all, you have to understand that microbia produce public goods. And in fact, they produce a lot of public goods. They're basically just clones of each other. And they're perfectly happy to do things like build, that slimy stuff that gets on your food. And that's like housing. They're building housing on your food, right? But in this particular paper, we're talking about yeast, and what they're producing is digestive enzymes. And since they don't have stomachs because they're microbia, they have to excrete those. And so some of them are overproducing them. So some of them are overproducing the enzymes, and some of them aren't producing any, right? So that's why it says here, a mixture of chiefs and cooperators can enable maximal group benefit. And you don't have to do anything complicated. There's no punishment, there's no cognition, it's only yeast. But if you have too many overproducers, the underproducers invade, right? Because that's cheap, it's easy. And if you don't have enough overproducers, then the underproducers starve, and the overproducers can eat food and breed up, right? So you're going to wind up with the right number to maximally exploit the substrate. And you might say, well, why don't they just produce the right amount, the producers? But the right amount changes way fast, right? Because it's just like an apple fell out of a tree or something, and suddenly there's all this stuff, right? All right, so yes, and so there's the corresponding underproducing and overproducing. Right, so the basic idea is that, as I just said, some individuals contribute too much, some contribute too little, and you can quickly get to the just right amount by adjusting the mixing population. And the thing we just saw with microbia, as I said, it does it with death, because life is pretty cheap. In fact, they do this kind of thing all the time. If you eat an apple and you've got bacteria on it, you suddenly increase the temperature, 99.999% of the bacteria die. The ones that are there reproduce up, have a good time in your intestines, come out the other end in 24 hours, 99.999% die because it's too cold now, right? But the point is that these things that are commonly happen to you are also things that you have common mutations for. So this is about evolvability. I probably shouldn't go there if I'm going to try to finish this talk in an hour. All right, so but go ahead and ask about that in Q&A if you want to know. Humans are super expensive, right? It takes us a long time to mature. We're pretty big. And so we don't want to just die every time we get it wrong. What we do instead is something flexible. And I suspect what's going on is group identity. And we'll come back to that a little bit. But if we shift our group identity and police, we might be able to get the right level of investment this way, shifting the mixes around. All right. So this only makes sense, first of all, if the optimum investment changes and if there's no good way to detect the current level of optimal investment, all right? So then you need some kind of a network to sense what's going on. And so I'll tell you, remind me when I've gotten further through this, what turns out to be the best sensing prediction for when humans shift this behavior. Because I haven't told you enough to tell you this yet. That's a great story. Okay, so we produced a paper to try to understand this. Now, I had previously been working, like I said, evolution of language, and all the ones that talked won, right? They just won all the time, and we didn't have this mix. So the first thing I had to understand was why is it that the altruists, all the good guys, aren't winning. And it turns out what it is this overproduction thing is key. So I make a little agent-based model. This is NetLogo. I hope you guys recognize do you recognize NetLogo? Yeah, okay. I don't know. If you don't know about agent-based modeling, ask me sometime. But the idea is there's two different species, free riders, which for some reason I made to be bunnies, the little white spots here, and then the altruists are the bees, because we all know bees make honey, which is why the altruistically produced food is orange, but they plant it, because I'm mixing my metaphors. So the altruists plant food, and the free riders don't. And the green stuff is food that's just there, because otherwise you can't bootstrap your simulation very well if there's not free food somewhere. Okay, so the way that I made the altruists overinvest, this is just the first stupidest thing I tried, it worked immediately, was that they planted without looking to see if there's already a plant there. Okay, so that's pretty easy to do. See right here, it says smart public good. If you turn that off, right? So smart public good is only planting if there's something there already, all right? If you don't do that, if you have stupid public goods investment, then you get this persistence. I mean, obviously it's not completely stable, but you persist with all the strategies. All right, which is what this says. All right. So yeah, smart public goods off, stable coexistence, and where we have smart public goods on, then you have the money is getting out-computed here. There's a little bit of mutation coming in, but basically they're wiped out. All right. So that's easy enough. And again, this is that was more like what happened in the language stuff we did. There was no cost except that you were giving away valuable information. Once everybody already knew the information, there was no cost anymore. So if you kept talking. So that's why we had them going to fixation in that model. Okay, so what if agents learn how much to invest? So now I'm going to allow them to evolve, and if I have a fixed ecology, right, then of course it'll learn, right? Evolution's good at learning stuff. But if the environment is changing faster than learning can learn, then you basically get a diversity with multiple dynamic peaks across a wide range. And if you also have defectors kicking around, then the lowest peak is at 0, which is basically competing with the free riders, and there's much less investment overall. All right. And so there we've got climate change turned on. You can do this easily. And so we have, you can't really tell from that because it's just a picture, but those peaks don't mean anything. They're just fluctuating constantly. Yeah.
Sorry, are defectors different than free riders?
No, sorry, I'm just using the same word.
Oh.
Good question again, and very easy answer. This is incidentally like how much food there is. So that's just showing you the climate change. But the yellow here is the agents. The green is the food, and the yellow is the agents. And as you see that the cooperators are getting more advantage eventually. It takes a long time with this kind of model, right? Okay. Earlier, when there were free riders, you didn't have. So this is basically a population of investment strategies across in the span of what was useful depending on the low and the high levels of climate productivity. This up here is the, what was I going to say, public good, right. You get this massive number of free riders there, and then you get this weird gap between them and the other ones. And I was like, where is this gap coming from? I thought it was a bug in the simulation for a while, but we'll come back to that. Actually, you can see it. Basically, what's interesting here is that, I'll just tell you the answer. The guys on the left are, their selection for a little extra advantage of public goods investment, but they are basically, but that optimal level is lower because there's free riders around. And the guys on the right are basically living in zones because you do tend to live near your mother, and therefore near your kin. They're living in zones where there aren't a lot of cooperators, and so they're back up in this population. They're sampling from this population. So that's why there's the gap. All right. So, is that polarization, right? So, as I mentioned before, these are stupid agents. They don't know. They don't have any idea of identity or anything. It's just what's adaptive. The only variable there is what is my public goods investment going to be, which is based on who was successful in the previous generation. All right. So, but what Nolan, McCarty and I speculated about last year, 2 years ago, 2016 APSA, was that maybe something reduces our sense of identity and could lead us to behaving, to feel that there's a different level of investment that we should be making to our society. And that may be sort of what's going on with political polarization. So the perceived cost benefit of group membership might be different. And so working with different others is both higher expected reward, but also higher risk. So that was sort of a hypothesis we had a couple of years ago. I just said this. But I will come back to that in the last part of the talk, right? But I want to now switch back to the psychology part. Okay, so here's the other regarding preferences stuff, which is super cool, and all you psychologists should run out and do. So psychologists are the opposite of economists. They make up numbers and they don't actually give them money. So but the psychologists keep showing that whether you give money or not, you get the same results, and the economists keep ignoring them. but anyway, so this was in whatever currency the Dutch had back in 1997, 1996, anyway, pre-Euro. But it doesn't matter, let's pretend we're Euro. Guilders, yeah. So they're saying, just pretend that I'm going to give you some number of guilders, and just pretend that some anonymous other you will never meet will get the numbers in this column. Which row would you prefer? All right, so everybody can think their own answer here. All right. So you will find people who will choose each of these. Okay? And so what the Van Lange et al. Said was that those people who seem to just sum these numbers and choose the largest sum, they called those pro-social. And the people who just chose the biggest number, they called individualist. Right? But there were some people who were willing to take a hit, right, to have the biggest possible gap between them and this imaginary other. All right? And those they politely call competitive. All right? Okay. So, I'm going to remind you briefly, this is all going to come together eventually. I'm going to remind you briefly of the order of where the most antisocial punishment was down here in Muscat in Athens, and up there, it says a city, but what they did is they went to the most prestigious university in that city, so they would try to be comparing similar undergraduates. So that's why I could call it Boston and Harvard. Anyway, you rotate it this way. I'm going to rotate the results this way, all right? Anti-clockwise. All right, so now here's Boston over here, and Melbourne, and over here is Athens and Muscat. And what do these colors mean? The pink is those who don't punish anyone. The green is those who only punish those who give less than they do. That awful top color is those who only punish those who give more than they do. And the purple ones are people who already, and this is just the first round, in the very first round, are already punishing both people who give more and people who give less than they do. All right? So, Fair and Dachter noticed that some people were punishing those who gave more than them, and they thought it was about revenge. But yeah, it's not revenge because it's happening in the very first round. These guys haven't got punished by anyone. All right? And this is the very last round out of these 10 rounds that they were doing, that Herrmann et al. Did. This is the Herrmann et al. Data. And you can see that a lot of people defect on punishment now. There's a lot more non-punishers. But a bunch of people don't defect on punishment. And clearly for these guys, it's not instrumental. And Karolina Sylwester, who actually drew these slides, and Herrmann and I have a paper that came out a few years ago reviewing the antisocial punishment literature. And believe me, it may sound like even the pro-social, the altruistic punishment sounds very hippie, oh, we want to keep everybody cooperating. But they do it because they're angry. Right? If you talk to these people, they hate the people that they're punishing, that weren't contributing adequately to the group or whatever. Right? But anyway, so this is not instrumental. They're punishing these guys even though there's no next round and they can't benefit. All right? But this is what, I think is the most salient thing. It's what's going on in the other rounds that, because beginnings and ends are kind of artificial. In real life, usually it's like it's an ongoing thing. And so here what you see is that the Harvard guys do not punish much at all. They figure out a lot on punishment. But what I think is actually more interesting, given this whole question about why are people doing antisocial punishment, that's what everybody cared about with that paper. It's not actually a very common strategy to only do antisocial punishment. Actually, what you see where there's a lot of antisocial punishment is a lot of mixed strategies. And if you remember that there's 4 people in these groups, then I would say that it looks like what's going on is this strategy of mixed punishment is independent of your own chosen level of investment. And so basically 1 in 4 people who would punish anybody also happen to be giving the least. And so then it just became all antisocial punishment. Does that make sense? Because if you're the one who's giving the least money, then you can't punish anyone who gave less than you, right? Okay. So yeah, there's free riding on punishment. Some people never do it. And this is like in any of the rounds, did you ever do this? And there's, as I just said, most of the variation in anti-social punishment is due to mixed strategies. So my theory down here is that, well, I should say zero. So I think there's just three strategies. There's free riding on punishment, there's altruistic punishment, and there's mixed strategy. And I think they correlate to the pro-social is the altruistic punishment, so people are very concerned about the group. The individualists are free riding, like why do I care what the other guys in the group do? I'm not going to punish them, I'm just doing my thing. And the competitive guys are indiscriminately punishing. They say, hey, I could spend money to get an advantage over the other guys because the experimenter will take away 3 if I give up 1. All right? Now, what I didn't show you before for the Van Lange, this is from this Van Lange paper. This is not an obscure paper. This is a heavily cited paper. There's like a whole literature's come out of this. But again, these are Dutch people of a particular age. These guys have lived through World War II and everything. But look at the numbers. Even here, when you're 60, hardly anyone sees this competitive strategy, but still that, having a few people, 5% or whatever in a population will still have a difference, right? These guys could be playing an important role. Certainly amongst the young people, we're talking about 13% of the population doing that. So yeah, for the Dutch, the vast majority are pro-social. And the individualists are more common than the competitors. And so my claim, keep on seeing this thing. My claim is that these guys, because remember, Herrmann et al. Were looking at undergraduates, so I'm going to claim that these dots are the most relevant. And if we go back and look at the, is anyone here Dutch? Okay, this is my being polite to the Dutch because I know they hate the Germans thing, but actually just look at Bonn, okay, because these are the two cities that are kind of closest to, but this isn't very close to Amsterdam. I think that's a pretty close mapping to what the undergraduate age people were doing. So I actually am sitting on data from this I haven't analyzed, but I think that we can show that people will take these two strategies, and the preliminary analysis looks like that, but I haven't got that paper out yet. But right now we'll just treat it as a prediction. Why do individuals engage in antisocial punishment? This is why I asked this a question before. Well, they don't. They only have 3 strategies. They ignore others, try to get others to support the group, or compete with everyone. And why does this vary with GDP? Okay, so this is, like I said, it's a hypothesis, and we haven't demonstrated this yet, but I sort of think that when you're poorer, your idea of who's your group is smaller. And this is actually one of Benedikt Herrmann's theories about what's going on, that the areas where there was higher antisocial punishment, there was also more tribalism. So if you're at Harvard, you just think, hey, I'm at Harvard, and you identify with everybody else in your group. And if you're in Muscat, you might think, well, look, there's all kinds of different people taking this experiment. I don't know who I'm cooperating with. How do I know if they're in group? All right. So, yeah. So I think, in variations, and also there's a GDP and the number of young do a correlation too. So we're getting more competitive people there. And I think that's why that regularity is happening. As further evidence about this, what happens when you, this is the first thing we did. How much do you change your strategy if you get punished? Well, if you didn't get punished, you have a pretty high probability of sticking with your current strategy, and if you don't have any particular direction in which you go. If you get altruistically punished, you're way more likely to increase than to decrease, and if you're also much less likely to stick on your position. If you are anti-socially punished, you're actually more likely to stay in your same position, and if you do change, it's a slight tendency to reduce, but it's basically you're at more chance. And then you say, well, but how do you know? Because you don't know who punished you, so we came up with a better answer than that. Again, looking at the proportions we were just talking about, if you're being anti-socially punished, I'm sorry, if you didn't give very much money, then you're more likely to have at least 2 people in your group punishing you, because there's both the altruistic punishers and the antisocial punishers or the competitive punishers. So, and that really tidies this up. You've got, if you just look and say, if I've only got one person punishing me, I may change my strategy, but I don't have a particular direction I move. But if I have more than one punisher, then I'm much more likely to increase. I figure there's a group, I must be in a group. After all, I didn't realize it. Okay, I'm going to invest more. Right? The other thing, as I mentioned, was that quite a lot of these areas you see as declining investment. When we looked at the investment in group-oriented punishment, we also get a similar decline, except in the final. The funny thing is that here, the final step is this big defect that you aren't investing as much. Here, the big defect is that you actually increase the amount of punishment in the final round, but otherwise you get the same kind of decline. Whereas for the antisocial punishment, there's no such regularity. It isn't something, so it doesn't seem to be socially oriented. Okay. So anyway, the claim, the general claim about what's going on here is that ethics is to find and sustain society of some kind. You have a little group here. It requires balancing individual and group level investment, and shifting the number of people playing different strategies may be one way to get that balance right. That might be part of what's going on here. All right. I have the feeling I've got way too many slides. What time did you want me to stop talking? It was 4.
We go till 5. It's 4:20.
We go till 5. It's 4:20. All right. I don't know if, I feel like I'll leave this. Well, if it's such a cute build. Why would you be doing this? The idea here is that, like, if you have 2 different groups, you have 2 choices here. You can either compete with your own group, or you can compete with the other groups, right? And so if you're able to, this guy punches that guy, and then if the whole group, those guys go down, right? Because they both lost something, the other one's lost more. But if by increasing the investment you get more group mates, then the whole group might do better. And even though he's given something up, he's winning over where he was before, right? But that doesn't explain antisocial punishment. Maybe I should have put this earlier. I'm just saying we have an idea that this punishment might be worth doing if it helps the whole group compete with another group. But if you can't have this context, if you can't have this kind of coherence, if there's a low rule of law, you're not reliably going to get your public goods, then maybe you wouldn't bother doing this. But that still doesn't explain antisocial punishment. So I think what they're doing when they're doing the antisocial punishment is they either think they're attacking another group, or they think that social status is the thing that's giving them that's going to give them more benefit. Right? That matters how big a slice they get in their own group's pie, right? Than how well their group does. So I think that's the only thing we can come up with on this. Again, a lot of these did get published. Do I want to talk? Yeah, I think we need to skip over this stuff. Yeah. Altruistic punishment doesn't explain cooperation. Most of the variation is ASP and cooperation, big C cooperation, where people signal with a 2, and you do get reduced levels of antisocial punishment if anybody in the group put out all their coins in the very first move. So again, that might be something that's signaling that that you were in an in-group context, because somebody was giving all their money to the group, and so maybe we are in group here.
Can you go back to that figure you just?
I've zoomed by. Yeah, it's pretty. I wasn't very happy that we did a linear model here, and Karolina is like, yeah, but that's what they did in the science paper. They got into science, so. But she just did the same analysis that Herrmann had all done.
So this is proportionate. So the more SQL cooperators, the less ASP expenditure.
Yeah, exactly. That was the only regularity we could find. We were desperately trying to find other kinds of things that we could pull apart, and this was the only thing we found out of the data. And this is exactly what you're supposed to do, so I should probably skip it. It's basically searching desperately for any kind of regularity in the populations, and we couldn't find anything. Except for this. Right. So anyway, let's go on to political polarization, because that's more topical, it's kind of more fun. All right. So what do we actually know about political polarization? Right. Inequality is the best by-county predictor for whether it's high inequality, you're more likely to vote for Brexit, you're more likely to vote for Trump, you're more likely to vote at the Swiss end of the freedom of movement with the EU, which is a huge political problem for them a few years ago that you may not have heard about. And I think you probably have heard about that some counties of Ukraine are rebelling against the Ukrainian government. But the level of inequality is the best by-county predictor of all this. That doesn't mean like wealth. Wealth is not a good predictor of voting for Trump or Brexit. It's about the inequality within the region that you're living in. So polarization, which is also basically identity politics, is not related to social media use. I should have put up the citation, so I forgot to do this. And it predates AI, which I'll show you. It does correlate with inequality. That's what I'm about to show you on the next slide. And the other thing that McCarty et al. Have figured out very recently is that one of the things that happens is that there's extreme position taking, and politicians seems to be driven by having one major donor that also has extreme positions, right? And McCarty et al., being political scientists, go, oh, isn't that interesting? So it's just that somehow these people get really rich, and then they're weird people get rich or something. But as a more biologically oriented person, I think what's happening there is that the donors who decide that they want to give a lot of money to politicians want to make sure that the only one giving money to the positions, and so therefore they take extremely eccentric positions. For example, saying that Russia's policy in the Ukraine makes a lot of sense. And then they want to hear the politicians saying that on television so that they can tell whether their interests are aligned and whether they have other sources for money to take. So the new hypothesis, so that's the stuff we actually know. The new hypothesis is that identity politics and social punishment and conformity are all being used to sort of reduce a risk profile when people feel like they're economically threatened. And it may be that that's because of the opening disparities that we see when we have increasing inequality. And I'm not going to be able to show you all of that, but I am going to be able to show you some cool, a bit of outcomes. But I'm going to describe it very qualitatively. But anyway, this is actually quantitative data, so you can see what's going on. So Nolan McCarty is an Americanist, so I apologize to those of you who think we should compare against. I usually do comparative across species. He's not even comparing across countries, but he does compare across states. All right? And years. So what's going on here is on the right, this is the polarization index. And the way they measure polarization is by just whether Republicans and Democrats are both appearing on legislation together as co-authors. Okay? So that's the lighter gray. And then the darker gray is income share held by the top 1%, and that's over there. Okay? And the reason this starts around 1913 is because that's when we banned alcohol. And we banned alcohol, we lost a major revenue source, and we invented the income tax. So that's why we're looking at income share, and I think part of the problem here is that, why we have like these weird, why it's more a tighter correlation here than in here, is because wealth is the real driver, and income is just a proxy on wealth, wealth inequality. But anyway, what you will notice is that after World War I, we have a bit of a drop in polarization, but then it recovers, but it seems to be unstable, and then after the crash of 29, it just plummets. And you get this long, weird period of relatively flat, low inequality, and low political polarization, but that kind of ends somewhere around 1978, all right? And so this is why people were saying, oh, is AI causing this? Because it was like 2008 or so, and unemployment was kind of high, and they said, oh, is AI causing it? Well, there wasn't a lot of AI back here. A lot, I didn't bring this graph, but I should probably throw it in. A lot of people, when they talk about inequality, they draw a graph like this, where this is 1945, and this is 1978. And what you see is you have, this is like productivity. You see why I draw, I use slides because my handwriting is terrible. And this is wages, right? And so they say, oh my gosh, this weird thing, which is the great decoupling when wages stop following productivity, and that's why we have inequality now. But I would argue that actually this might be the weird period. And if you look back here, because this looks pretty weird down here, this is very flat. Let me show you another graph. This is taking it back further. You see some kind of oscillation going. And some people claim that there's been actually not that many oscillations, but the oscillations are kind of normal, right? And so yeah, Scheidel wrote this book last year claiming that basically you have to have more to get inequality back. But I think that, or to get equality back. I think that that's sort of oversimplifying the changes in the directions of some of these things. I think governance can reduce inequality as well. Yeah, again, when I found out that my stuff looked a little bit like what was going on with this data, I went back into literature, and there's a beautiful paper, some of the other people on that paper are like Novak and Karolina Sylwester. But you know, they have a really basic network model, and they also get just oscillations between cooperative and uncooperative behavior with nothing else going on. You know, and so you know, maybe this stuff just happens. But anyway, I think what's going on, Nolan and I think what's going on is that maybe inequality is being increased because we get these new distance-reducing technologies, right? So in the late 19th century, you know, now what's going on is the internet, right? So these internet companies are piling up all the money, and that's distorting things. In the late 19th century, it could have been news, you know, telegraph, rail, oil, even that you could ship oil so much more cheaply than you could ship coal and wood. So, and again, if you think of the people who had a lot of money and then indeed wound up getting broken up by the government, back at that period, it was like the oil companies, but also the big news moguls, you know, the rail people, they had all the money. And it's not that there's something wrong with that. It's great when you invent a new technology. But when you reduce the cost of distance, a smaller number of people get all the money, right? We're going to go to dinner tonight, and we're probably not going to go, I mean, no offense, maybe I'm wrong, but we probably won't go to the best dinner in all of California. We're going to probably go to some combination of pretty good dinner and pretty close, right? And we're going to optimize between those. When you reduce the cost of dinner, there's fewer, it's not dinner, of the cost of distance, then you have fewer winners, right? And I don't think it's a first mover effect. I think it really is some combination of quality. There were a lot of search engines before Google, but they got enough stuff together, and now everybody does them because they have a lot of advantage, right? So there's some feedback. So yeah, it seems that, again, this is almost a definition of governance is redistribution. And I think what we need to do now, if we want to reduce this, is figure out, of course, again, in America and in Britain, we're doing the opposite of this. The governments seem to have figured this out, that the way they got in was by inequality, and they seem to be trying to increase inequality, which is not good. It both reduces the, it actually starts at the point now, we're at our Gini coefficients around 0.41. So we actually start both getting more destruction because of people being very angry, but also just the economy starts falling because people don't have enough money to spend, right? So I suspect, back to this, I forgot to say what was going on, this great coupling was probably, well, initially it was FDR, and he was investing all this money. You know, we know that about the New Deal. They invested massive amounts of money giving people work, government money. Then there was World War II, which was obviously a lot of government spending. And then there was the Cold War. Why did blue-collar factory workers make such high salaries in the first place? Right? I think that may have been a deliberate policy redistribution. That when the Soviet economy plateaued, people thought, oh, we don't need to do that anymore. And I think they thought they were combating communism and Marx or something, or just the Soviets, but that was a proxy for inequality. And what we figured out in the early 20th century was that even the elite, I mean, they all came and signed up. I mean, the so America solved this problem earlier than Europe because the elite, or a bunch of them, coalitioned with the proletariat in the Democratic Party. And in 1945, everybody got together in these rooms in Europe and said, okay, no more wealth extraction. They actually banned all the international banking rules for wealth extraction. But unfortunately, those got re-innovated in the late 60s. Anyway, yeah, I think I just talked about this. So I have a model, but it's not my model, it's Alex's. It's Alex Stewart's, and he's a new professor in Texas. He's an absolute genius. If anybody here is an undergraduate or a master's student, doesn't have a Ph.D. yet, or if you're about to graduate and you do modeling, but I'm not going to go into great detail about this because we still haven't finished the paper and we're hoping to put it somewhere embargoed or at least get it into archive. And also, I'm just not that good at it because he didn't do an agent-based model. He did a numerical model. But it was of, let me give you the intuition for what's going on. My intuition was that when a lot of people talk about being in equilibrium all the time. They think nature's always in equilibrium, but actually there's floods, there's feasts, there's famines. And when you're below the carrying capacity, you can explore. You can do risky things like working with a very diverse group. But when you're over the carrying capacity, because there's a drought or something, there's basically some kind of selection event and you start competing around particular solutions. So that was my intuition. The assumptions that Alex was more happy to sign up to was just that in-group cooperation is both lower risk, but also has a lower expected or average outcome, right? And that was, I think that was already, I mentioned that in the previous slide. So Alex's model showed indeed, so what's going on here, I should say. So this is sort of the environmental quality. He's just choosing some arbitrary 0 point, but positive and negative. Environmental quality, and then, so I was expecting this only to be an impact because the environmental quality was shrinking, but he shows it happening even in relatively stable situations, so low or high environmental quality, and then he also has the probability of a successful out-group interaction. All right, so that's one of the things that, so basically you can tolerate higher, you can tolerate higher failure rates of out-group interactions when the environment quality is higher, and as it declines, you start working more with the in-group, right? So that becomes the better thing to do. But then the interesting thing is this: as stuff gets really bad, it starts becoming a better idea to invest with the out-group again, because basically you aren't going to make it just working with your in-group, right? So even though it's a gamble, you have to take that gamble at this point. So that's sort of the intuition. Like I said, I'm super excited about this paper, but we haven't. It's not. I hope it'll be out in bioRxiv by the end of the month, but I don't know, or SSRM. We haven't decided that yet. But anyway, I'm sorry not to go into that much detail about this. And I think I will just totally skip. Sorry, I have some stuff about the trust game. This is already published, but I want to skip ahead because I think I've been giving you too much stuff. But you can ask about this stuff if you want. So I think I already talked about that. So let's just do the conclusions. So back to what I was saying before, I think that we shouldn't just think of altruistic meaning good thing you should do all the time. We need to think of it as increasing investment in the public, but there's only so much you can invest in one public. You've got to deal. Apparently, speaking of the East, there's a Slavic saying: if you don't steal, you steal from your family. Right? There's always some other public, or including yourself, that you might want to, the very smallest possible public, that you may have to balance your intuitions between. You've got to trade these off. The optimal trade-off might be best achieved by having these mixed strategies, and people try to overnight. Oh, you guys didn't remind me of that thing. Remember I said, ask me so the economists have been trying to figure out what predicts what your behavior is. They couldn't find anything. The political scientists, I've seen them, they couldn't find anything. the psychologists found a correlate for the different strategies. And you'll never guess what it is, so I'll just tell you. And this is only for the group who are the very group-oriented ones. It's people with sisters. It's not women, it's people with sisters. All right? Which is really interesting. You can think of different, proximate causes for that. But as a computer scientist, I just think, wow, what a great way to flip a coin, right? And also, you can see that as being some kind of information about this being over or under the carrying capacity thing. Because if you've been able, if your sister, if you have a sister, then that means that somebody is able to get to grow to maturity, at least 2 people in your family, right? And in particular, female. But I don't know why it's mostly sister, not brother. But anyway, so I think it's an interesting thing. And I think that's part of what's going on. So in conclusion, constant punishment may allow individuals to regulate social investment behavior. And we've seen that it does change the social investment behavior because in some of those graphs I showed you. Socially destructive behavior may itself be seen as a public good if you think about regulating public goods investment to a useful level as a public good. So how's that from brain bending? Right? The mechanism makes sense if and only if it's easier to overproduce, underproduce, and regulate than to optimize as individuals in a dynamic environment. And actually, I think one of the transitions we're going through now is that we may be able to get more information and sort of shift the way that we do all these sorts of things. But that'll have a lot of consequences on what we're used to thinking about in terms of individual liberty and things. So AI and the information society is an interesting thing. But anyway, this may also be part of what explains, or these sorts of dynamics may help us understand political polarization and identity politics. And that could be very important to stabilizing our future. So anyway, thanks to all the people that helped me and for you guys for putting up with a long, slightly rambling talk. So, yes?
Could you go deeper into how the model that you presented has anything to do with the history of production and inequality that you presented before?
Well, right now, it doesn't have anything to do with inequality per se. It only has to do with economic well-being. But what we're guessing, and that would have to be something we'd have to go do more research over, is that that when you have increased inequality, one of 2 things is going on. One is that you just, and this is something, you can read this in a lot of the theorists who are talking about identity politics, that something about inequality changes your understanding of identity, and so you don't see yourselves. If you interview Trump voters, both as, again, the rich and the poor, in these highly unequal counties, they say that they don't believe that money being spent at the federal level is benefiting them. And of course, as we all know, that they're often come from the states where the most federal money is flowing into, but they don't believe it. So they believe that there's some other entity, that they aren't really a part of this larger group that they're being asked to contribute to. So it may be something about inequality that when you see people with massively more or massively less money all around you, you feel less identity. Or what our model is suggesting, it may just be that you feel poorer, or enough people feel poorer that then they feel like they need to pull into the identity politics. Because even the people up the hockey stick of a Gini coefficient, so it's a zip curve. So you've got, every year, if you look at the Oxfam numbers or whatever, the number of people that have, that have more money than half of the planet or whatever is shrinking massively. So these guys, whoever is here is closer to this guy than they are to that guy, and that's freaking them out. In terms of sequence. I'm sorry, we're assuming that these are sequences, and so these are dots, right? So it's just really shunting up. So the model we're doing with Alex so far is only saying why if the economy declines. But what we know from the literature is that it isn't actually the economy that matters. It's not how much you have, it's how much you have relative to what you used to have. All right? And again, I have to believe that's probably about perceptions rather than actual because, it depends. When we have increasing populations, you would expect that you're gonna have like longer commutes and you're gonna have smaller houses. So if you look at that as your proxy for wealth, then yeah, you really are worse off. But in other terms of other things, like even public health for poor people and things, we're so much better off. Obviously, we didn't used to be able to Google anything before Google, right? There's so many things we have now that we just didn't have anything like. They say wages have stagnated since the late 70s, but I can tell you we have a lot more stuff, except maybe cars per populace, but otherwise we have a lot more nice things, like espresso. Yeah.
So ties well into my previous question, the one being, what's the PGG supposed to stand for?
All right.
Because
So
it seems to work well for extractive processes, but like cooperative and constructive processes seem to follow a different
yeah,
pattern.
the trust thing that I just jumped by entirely. Oh no, it wasn't even the trust one. Well, some of those games, the cooperative games, when you're talking about like, oh yeah, the trust game actually was sort of like this. Like we also talk about donation games and things like that. And the best practices we can think of are even just like, do you take the time to help someone you walk by and you see that they're holding a map and they're lost? Or just holding, telling someone that they've dropped something. And a lot of people have worked on when do you take those kinds of time. So I don't think it's only about like, bridges and stuff. I really do think it's about community investment. When do you take the time? When do you go home and spend half an hour a day, editing Wikipedia versus just like watching television, right? I think there's all kinds of things. And the fact that it does correlate with rule of law, which might itself be seen as a public good, right? Are you invested in in obeying the law? Or also that it's correlated with GDP, right? And as I said, it is definitely one of the things that's hard about this. See, I come from psychology. And so when I think about causality, I have the total naive idea, like there's a cause and there's effect. And for an animal, there really is. There's like, you have perception, you have action, right? You have even reflexes, but also, whatever. In real systems that aren't just animals, they haven't been broken up by neurons, right? There isn't just like one cause or one effect, right? These things definitely do feed into each other. And so that having low GDP, if you have less money, then you have less resource to invest in trying to enforce the rule of law, right? And why is there low GDP in the first place? If you are having a drought, if you're in part of the world that's really being whacked by climate change, then it's less likely that the stuff, the grand plans you have are going to work, right? So there's a vicious cycle. Incidentally, back to that causality thing, my favorite theory, which I think, I've heard it from people, I don't read enough philosophy as I should, but it's like Hugh Price and Judea Pearl are the people that attributed this, that you call something a cause if humans can change it. And a lot of people are trying to do patches on this where they're trying to say, oh, let's get people that don't think they have anything in common to talk to each other. And I suspect that's going to be less efficacious than doing things like increasing minimum wage, which are known to bring down inequality. I mean, one of the things, if you look at Europe right now has the way higher social mobility than America, and it has the Eurozone alone is a larger economy. It passed this in 2007. Nobody talks about it. They only talk about China because it's one country. But economies are defined by the currency. So anyway, they're doing very well. They have a much higher level of taxation. I personally lived in Denmark, as mentioned in my intro. They don't lock doors there, and everybody that I was working with, there was a lot of Americans who were all the same age as I was, and they're all like, this feels like the late 60s, early 70s in America. Well, in the late 60s and early 70s, the tax rate in America was 50%, and it's 50% in Denmark. And the Danes are happy with that, and they have this feeling that they know that at least when I was there in '98, they were saying like, yeah, sure, we'll all probably spend 30% of our lives unemployed and doing art or something because we could do that. Our state could do that for us. And if a factory closes in Scandinavia, they go in and they retrain the town on some other thing. They have money to spend and they spend it and they create greater stability. So, but that is redistribution, right? Anyway, yeah.
Well, so just to jump on that,
Yeah.
Related to what you're talking about with antisocial punishment and sort of tribalism. I mean, I went to Denmark last summer, and I was, it's very sort of like easy to see it as like a socialist paradise, but it's also like immigration there is really hard, and there's a lot of extreme like antagonism toward non-Danes, especially non-Northern Europeans.
It's yes and no. They do always. It is hard to immigrate there because they have very generous benefits, and they change the benefits partly to deal with this, so that now you have to have worked for 7 years before you can start doing this just living off the state thing. But as I understand, the level of antagonism there is lower than other parts of Europe. So you can see this is difficult, but there is definitely, like the rest of Europe, there is increasing the Nationalist Party is also getting things. I don't want to say it's the best. In fact, yeah, so some people don't like to talk about the Scandinavian examples in general because they're relatively small and relatively homogenous. Population is low now in Finland. But there's at least 3 different language groups that have historic issues with each other. But anyway, the Germany is quite interesting too. And Sweden took what, 1 million? Or did they take 100,000? I think they took 100,000 immigrants during the immigration crisis. But and then Germany took 1 million. And Germany is 90 million people. And again, they aren't quite as, and they're not perfect either. I'm not saying that these places are total paradises, but they did things like, they just had, again, this is like government, they didn't have to do a stimulus because it was already set up that if, when companies were in trouble, they were allowed to sort of half lay off their people, so they only had to pay half the salaries. And then the other half, they could just get welfare. And so then this huge proportion of people were getting welfare, and there was massive automatic redistribution. And then it's not like they're an agile economy, anything but. They have like way too much bureaucracy. But they were damped through, and so they were the first ones to recover pulling back out of 2008. I mean, 2008 was kind of a weird blip because it was just a loss of liquidity because the banks had really screwed up. And so there was no particular structural problem except for that when the money started flowing in, then you could start doing business again. But the question was what happened to the people during that period. And again, I would expect with all the ICT that we're going to have more of that kind of thing. And so we need to think about how do we damp through those things and help people just get through to the next job. But anyway, yeah. Oh, sorry, I missed on the left side.
Yeah. So just to go again to the relationship between talking about and the history presented.
Yeah.
So just maybe I just didn't understand the analogy, but is the period of reduced inequality during the 40s until the 29 to 77 or 78,
yeah.
Is that
30s.
a case of like increased intergroup cooperation, or is it?
Yeah. Well, that was like literally the. Pull that graph back up. Yeah. So the light gray here is literally the two political parties cooperate, right? Now that's not the only cooperation across the whole country, and you will find other people that measure identity politics other ways than this. This is the particular measure that these guys, Rojas, McCarty, and Shore, but actually McCarty and his Ph.D. supervisors worked a lot on coming up with this measure of polarization. But it correlates really well with a lot of the other measures of identity politics that the sociologists come up with. And it's certainly, it is literally, how important is tribalism is driven by how much, partly as we are seeing right now, how acceptable it is to your voters that you're working with the other party. So it is a decent policy.
Right, but it also sort of masks a lot of, maybe this is what Pablo's getting at, it also masks a lot of very major problems in American political history at the time. In a sense, Democrats and Republicans kind of flipped the whole Southern strategy. They were probably a lot more on the same page when it came to issues of racial inequality and so on. So I think it's kind of glossing over.
Just to add to that, that's the period of the most social deference.
Exactly.
Like there were like 100,000 of strikes every year. I don't think that's very cooperative at all. Especially, for example, of like the same as the Scandinavian countries have been seen as like seeing them as cooperation, maybe traveling think, like, when considering that all of those welfare programs were won by unions and socialist parties and so on, that like cooperation was never this strategy of any of those groups. It was more confrontation.
Yes and no.
You can see that the parties were made to agree at that point by greater social effervescence than just. I mean, I think that the measure of cooperation there is very skewed because parties are, at least at that point, were not really linked to anything but themselves, except for FDR.
So I do worry about this myself because I do know that, like, especially in the UK, there was a lot of, as you say, disruption, but in the 70s that also helped lead to the Reagan, Thatcher, and Reagan era, and obviously there was a lot of disruptions around Vietnam and race, so in America. One of the things about race, though, is that, and this is very depressing, but it does seem like there may have been a very long, race hasn't gotten that much better. It's just that sometimes other things dominate it, and so it could be that there was like a damping in other kinds of things, and then definitely race opened up as this huge, like another axis. So like the left-right. So some people think the left-right one mattered less because race became more important. But the other possibility is race became more important because the left-right thing mattered less. So it's hard to see what was actually happening on the ground. It's a bigger question. I'm not a sociologist, but I agree with you that it might be an issue. But as I said, and this is part of the reason that we're waiting, we haven't put the paper in, and Alex and I are not doing this by ourselves, is this stuff is correlating with a lot of other measures which Nolan is the expert on. So I'm waiting to read the stuff he says, oh yeah, this is great. This explains a whole lot of the open questions that we had and all the stuff that's out there and blah, blah. So I'm waiting to read our paper too. So I'm sorry about that. No, it's not very satisfying. But he feels like this is actually that they're even whether you call it polarization or you call it identity politics has been a big question that people fought about a lot. And Nolan really likes this stuff because it kind of brings these two things together and says you don't have to have that battle because you're actually taking it in two different descriptions of the similar kinds of problems. Oh, but I know what I was going to say. Sorry, I remember. When we were talking about the unions, the unions were stronger at that period. And yes, of course, then they were fighting against parts of society. But I mean, I'm in the union right now that was on strike last week. The British higher education, there's one union that represents all the professors, and our pension they're taking away like £10,000 a year, which is pretty massive reduction given you don't get that much anyway in the first place. So it's been the biggest strike action in I don't know how long. Getting coherent strike action is, again, a massive public good. So it's not the public like the entire UK, but to get that kind of cooperation across the sector is actually quite impressive. So, but I see what you're saying because this is conflictual to some of the other pieces. But yeah, and it's an interesting problem, and we'll see if we get that paper out or not. And if we get it written, then to see where we get it in and how people respond to it. But yeah, good questions. Yeah.
On that sort of same vein, it seems like maybe part of addressing this would be that maybe like you were talking about before, there's different sizes of public, right? And so having a public good is sort of like you're doing something for some public, right?
Yeah.
So we're talking about like levels of cooperation. There's obviously different sizes of public. So one size of your public is your union, another size is your whole country, another size is the party. And so I'm wondering if maybe there's some like you're talking about how you were more likely to be do pro-public stuff for your in-group compared to your out-group in certain times of inequality. Is there some maybe more hierarchical structure to when you're like the closest in-group to you, or maybe you do it at moderate in-group levels at certain levels of inequality, maybe you only reach all the way across the other political party and to the whole country if you're in a very, very low inequality state or something like that? Just curious.
Yeah, no, I think that makes sense. But I don't have anything else to say to that, but yeah, no, it's, yeah, I'm sorry, is that a question or a statement? Sorry.
Well, I was curious if that answered sort of what Ramesh and Pavel were talking about, where they're like, well, there was a lot of conflict at this time, and I'm wondering if maybe it has to do with comparisons of scale of which
The
public
scale of
they're
the
talking
conflict.
about, right?
Yeah,
Because
yeah.
there's less like moderate sizing your conflict with you and your union, but maybe more between your union and somebody else.
Yeah, but that's still, it's sort of, I think something like that might be what's going on. And at the same time, I'm not sure that makes the model, the several models pull together, which is what I guess we're trying to do here. My intuition is that, yeah, so some of the stuff that's visible there is the fact that we were thinking like a country and we were trying to get the country to do or not to do things. But, yeah, no, I think you're right. That's one of the possibilities. I mean, one of the possibilities is that period of low inequality, which we know was low wealth inequality as well. So that was definitely measuring. Well, sorry, that was the income that was being up there. But that created lower polarization at the elite level, but not necessarily at the household level, right? Or some other small scale. But I mean, I don't know. It's just really hard. It's awful. It's awful that four students got killed at Kent State. But compared to what was happening in Vietnam, 4 is not a very large number. That was like So I don't know to the extent to which the disruptions we all know about. I mean, like all the conflicts. There was terrorism in the 70s in Europe. There was not just the IRA. There was Italian and German terrorism as well. Domestic terrorism. But again, the number of people killed by that, we're really shocked and horrified by that, but compared to the number of people that get murdered or even killed by cars, was not that large. So I don't know. But I'm hoping that once I'm sorry that I didn't have the paper ready. I was really hoping we'd have this done by the end of January. So, but I don't know for sure, and I'm eager to see what the reviewers feed us back to. So we'll see how this comes.
Okay,
But thanks for thinking about a lot of these lines.
we're just about out of time.
Okay.
We can, informal discussion continue, but the
Okay,
official session is over. Let's thank
Okay.
Dr. Bryson.